this house, in the strict media coverage of school shootings, I'd like to invite Mr. Mark Horton to open the debate for us.
People like Adam Lanza, Dylan Klebold, Eric Harris and Cho Sung Hoi have, and a larger list than that, have written their names upon the history books of the United States and garnered for themselves through school shootings the kind of infamy and the kind of long-lasting fame and terror that they so craved and they so desired. People, through the media reports and using the media reports that were made after those killings, have agonized over the motivations for the shootings at places like Sandy Hook and Columbine, and we have come no further. We have blamed books, we have blamed rap music, we have blamed parents, we have blamed mental disability, we have blamed literally anything we can think of, and we still don't know why these young men do these things. We think these discussions are completely pointless. They lead us literally nowhere, and they also lead to situations where people are both encouraged to commit these kinds of atrocities and informed about how they should do so. The two things I'll talk about, therefore, are exactly those things, the discourse and the infamy. What we want the media to do is to publish literally no details about the shooter and literally no details about their motivations for those particular shootings. These are the same kind of restrictions that we put in place about reports on suicide happenings, where we don't allow them to mention in any case how that particular suicide happened. It's the same kind of idea. We don't want to know anything about the particularities of how it happened, or the particularities of who the shooter was, or why exactly they did it. We are happy for them to report that a school shooting occurred, and we are happy for them to report about the particular individuals who may have been victims of that school shooting and the actions which may be heroic that they took during that particular shooting. So the first thing then that I'm going to talk about is discourse. It's a clarification. No, thanks. So discourse, and how little it is possible to learn in these particular situations. We kid ourselves that these instances can in some way be understood, that these motivations can in some way be brought to the fore, because it's obviously like something which we desire. We want to know why these horrible things have happened. We want to know why these people were the victims. We want to know how we can prevent it in future. Is there something that we can do to stop these people from thinking that this is an appropriate action? So we turn to things. We blame Stephen King for writing particular books. We blame Marilyn Manson songs for being violent. We blame parents. We blame mental health issues. We blame video games. No, thank you. But we never link these things in any way to that killing, in any meaningful way, because every individual one is different, but every individual one is carried out by a person who is so badly corrupted that they no longer have the kind of things which are recognizable human traits in terms of the rationale, in terms of the way that they make their decisions before carrying out these atrocities. There is no way that we can link, and we can actually link back to that rationale which they had when they committed those atrocities, because they are so far away from a human atrocity. That's why we seek other things to blame in these situations, because we cannot believe that somebody could have committed this thing in and of themselves, that this is something which has come out of their head. So we think there must be something else. But countless case studies have shown that we do not understand, that we're no closer to understanding now why these people sought to do these things than we were when we first started. Because everybody has a theory, but nobody actually understands. The only thing we ever learn is that they in some way, no thank you, wanted to be noticed. That's the only thing that we learned, that they wanted to make an impact upon the world. We learned nothing more than that in terms of what their motivations are in any particular instance, because they're so far away from what is human. Therefore, the only relevant discourse is discourse about how we best protect people from people who are so far gone, no thank you, that they no longer make rational decisions and they can no longer be reasoned with in any meaningful way. Neither can their actions be in any way predicted, as is the case across all of these things, where we see people just happen to drop out of school, go off the radar perhaps, and then the next thing that people know is they carry out these kinds of atrocities, so they're completely unpredictable. The only relevant discourse is about protection, about perhaps whether or not you place guards on the gates of schools, about whether or not you place particular people who have weapons inside of schools. These are the kind of discussions, and I'll take it in one moment, which can still occur when we report on these shootings, but are in no way contingent upon us knowing details about that killer himself. So this kind of discourse, which is practical and is helpful, is the kind of discourse we still allow for. Please.
Why do you think the school shooting that happened in Dunblane in Scotland, like 15 to 20 years ago, has never inspired a copycat in the UK, despite the free media reporting on it?
I have no idea about why it hasn't, but I don't think anybody has any idea about why it hasn't, because it's very difficult to understand the motivations of these people in these situations. So there is no reason for us, therefore, to report on those particular motivations. The second thing that I want to talk about then is in terms of how we grant that infamy and how we enable these killings to happen. Because it is plausible that were there someone who was borderline when Dunblane happened, that we would in fact have informed them, firstly, about how they should carry out that act, and secondly, about the kind of infamy that it could garner for them. So let's look firstly about how to carry out that act. Because the reason why we don't report on suicides in terms of how they happened is because we don't want to make it, we don't want to give instructions to people. We don't want to make these kinds of things, these kinds of actions which we think are heinous, easier for people in terms of school shootings by telling them where people entered into that building. What were the particular mistakes that they made that led to them being captured? Who did they kill first? And did killing that person first, for instance in Sandy Hook killing the principal and those teachers first, did that make it easier then for them to actually rack up a larger hit count than they otherwise would have? These are all of the things which can be analysed by people in the planning stages for a killing or something like that, which make it far more likely that if a killing happens, it's going to be more deadly because they are better able to understand what the response might be and how exactly they should plan their shooting so it is as deadly as possible. Secondly, it shows very clearly that these killings are very good ways of achieving the kind of infamy that you want to achieve. That they get you the kind of recognition that perhaps you are craving and the kind of infamy that perhaps you are striving for. So people strive to be worse than the last one. But more specifically than that, the media coverage shows them that there is a specific route that is available for them and that their name is one that will be plastered across all of the news channels. So if it is something which they're doing for infamy, they're doing for recognition, then very clearly it is the case that by granting them this recognition, then we are encouraging these shootings to happen by allowing this kind of reporting. Given that all we can know is that what they want is for someone to notice them when they're on their way out. Clearly, therefore, we shouldn't allow them to be noticed. I move to oppose.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to call on Mr. Bell.
James,
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm incredibly proud to be addressing you all this evening, and having unavoidably proven that not all British debates are dreamy, I hope I can make up for proving that some of us aren't boring as well. I'm bringing two main things today. First one, I'm going to talk about the alternative responses you get from the media when you ban them from accessing the facts we may know about the motivations, why we think that leads to more speculation and more bias from the media. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why this damages the political responses we could take in favour of things like gun control that may have a tangible impact on the ability of these shootings to happen further in future. First of all, on the idea that this is a copycat thing that people do because they've seen it before, we think they've missed their burdens here in talking only about schools. We think that if we're still reporting on people who go and shoot a bunch of people in the cinema or shoot a bunch of people in public, that still applies and they're still going to seek notoriety that way. Secondly, in the idea that the only way they know how to kill or that they do it is because they've seen these things, they have some kind of templates to follow. We don't think that that's true. We think people who are going to schools aren't going to be to pump rounds into the bodies of children and not being put off doing so because they're not quite sure who to shoot first. We think they go in, we think they shoot whoever is available and whichever target presents itself without that sort of plan. Secondly, we contend the idea that we can never know anything about the motivations of the individual in person. If we get patterns that they did all turn out to be mentally ill, or that many of them tended to be taking certain kinds of drugs or undergoing certain kinds of treatments, that may provoke a debate about the way we treat the mentally ill in America, about whether or not making that something that's available in public healthcare might be a good motivation to treat. We can certainly tell in cases like Timothy McVeigh, when they go out of their way to tell us what their assumptions were. We go back to the guy's house, and his house is full of Nazi memorabilia. We probably get some sort of clue there. In those cases, we think that that's a good thing. So what's the alternative, right? That when the media can't report on facts, we think that actually can't reflect the facts that are available, right? We think that actually leaves them freer to construct narratives that suit their own political biases, right? So if the guy happens to be black and you've got someone who wants to speculate about some sort of innate predisposition for those people to things like violence, we think not having the objective facts that we know about the case maximize their ability to make those biases present in society. Moreover, right, we think that often the unknown is scary. So if you always assume the worst about the people who you don't know anything about, people tend not to respond, believe it or not, to school shootings particularly rationally. They always tend to assume that isn't something that could be done in a limited number of circumstances. If they don't know anything about motivations, they think this might be something that's held by everybody, in which case they're more likely to take irrational responses to that in terms of arming up themselves or withdrawing from society entirely. If we don't allow the facts that exist to deny that this is in fact something that doesn't just belong to the common possible denominator. Moreover, right, we think we just get mass speculation about this. These bits of speculation on things like Twitter immediately after things happen, which we have like no ability to censor, given that the Chinese government is completely incapable of censoring it. And you give huge credibility to any conspiracy theorist or nutter who can turn up and claim that they're a government spokesperson, or that they are a whistleblower, or that they were present at the time, and they can tell you. That has a huge amount of credibility to people who want to perpetrate their own incredibly bad narratives that might say, well, this person was clearly a Muslim. I can tell you, I know that this person was acting out of terrorism. That's much worse on things like Twitter, where there's no incentive for self-regulation. The media company doesn't have a stake in upholding its own reputation as a good and reliable resource of facts, so we get those biases much more right immediately after it has happened, right? We think that they just focus on anything they can dredge up or anything they can speculate about when it suits their own political purposes. So on to those political responses are widely damaging. Alright, so.
Every single time policymakers try and seek change after an attack, there is a person to blame. A person who say who was the fault and not the gun. How will change ever happen so long as we always have that person to put in the limelight?
Well, we think the gun helps. We think that when it comes to getting rid of it, there is plenty of people who are always willing to come out and say we should have more gun control when there's been gun shootings. We're going to discuss now why you limit their ability to do it. So we recognize in places like America, right, your ability to own your gun narrative, the Second Amendment narrative, is bound up with the distrust of governments, in that the main justification they use is that you need a gun to protect yourself from the state that is censoring things from you and that is being a threat to you. The point at which we actively engage in denying information to the public that might get out there as a government mandate would create exactly the kind of thing that they speculate about and that empowers their rhetoric, right? We recognize that the debate over gun control in America is not simply a debate about how many people will die if we, for example, limit the size of magazines. It's also a debate about liberty. It's also a debate about whether people are willing to trust their governments. If they're not willing to trust their governments because the government has already engaged in denying the facts in the past and may do so again in the future, then they're much freer to say you need your gun because the government is a threat to you. Or even if they don't go that far, they say, well, the government's not giving you the facts on gun control. How can you side with its agenda when it's fundamentally denying you things that it knows? It might be lying to you. You've got no directive to know that. So you hugely empower that side of the debate. Not only is that problematic, because debates are kind of hard to take place, as I think we all know at some point, if you don't have any objective facts to hand, but it also means that the ability of those groups to interact with each other is threatened. So we recognise that you do get a shutdown of the ability of Democrats or Republicans to come across the aisle and to stand up and talk to the other groups, right? Because those people say there's no common facts that are available to us, and there's hugely more distrust of it. If you get rid of that, and you say that guns are something special that can't be discussed, and especially school shootings is something that can't be discussed, the real people you harm are the people who want to make honest assessments of what the motivation might have been, and whether or not the motivation could have been mitigated if that person hadn't had a gun or hadn't had a high-capacity magazine to hand. We think many more people become scared. Mr. Speaker, ultimately, this does not help the ability of us to get anything this does not help the ability of us to get political action that might cut down the number of people killed. What it does do is give huge credibility to anyone who wants to use the shooting to push their own political agenda if we deprive them of any counterfacts that might exist, so we can talk about the actual reality of that shooting and the actual reality of the motivations of the person who's responsible for it. It's for these reasons Ruairi and I are incredibly grateful.
Thanks, Ben. I'd like to call on Christine Simpson to review the case and recite it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we talk about the legitimacy of restriction, why we should do it in this instance. Second, about the impact that it has on individuals, on the people who might commit crimes in the future, on the victims and on their families, all of the people involved. And then about finding the causes and why it doesn't happen when people in the Sun blog about it and leave comments under threads. We don't think that's where the truth comes from, so we don't think it's anything particularly strong that we're losing when that's all the discourse becomes. But before I do, a couple of things on what we just heard. So for a while they got a bit worried that we were going to let people not have any real facts, but be like, no, we're not sure and we can't tell you, but I assume he was probably black. No, they'll probably just, we won't let them publish that too, because that would be even worse than publishing the truth, because it would be all random speculation. We'd probably just get rid of that one. It would be weird for us to say no to truth but yes to racism. They say that if you don't know every single specific about them, then you have to be afraid of absolutely everyone in your school. The problem is that loads of the coverage focuses on like some guy that took biology with them when they were 11, being like, no, he was just a normal guy. And when that's the sort of rhetoric that you get as part of it, then you do think it could be anyone, it could be everyone around you. And you get those irrational debates they don't want about gun control, right? But when you have a specific set of facts, and you let these people who actually know about policy make policy, no 2 seconds ago, still no, Michael. Right, then they tell you that you'll get really afraid of government when you're told that they can restrict things from you and not give you all of the facts all of the time. We already restrict information from people when we think that they're not very good at handling it, and when we think our policy decisions as a result are worse. We don't think that people are massively distrustful of government because sometimes we have trials in camera, or because you're not allowed to publish details of suicide. We think you can explain to the population that they aren't very good at processing that information, and we'd rather leave it to people who are good at processing that information, as we would prefer to do. No thanks. So then they say, well, we can't get it on Twitter, maybe people will tweet about it. It would still be less prevalent because that's not where people get their reliable news from. So they do understand there's just a load of people just talking about stuff. But also we're getting better at regulating Twitter, at getting things removed, and we don't really see why they can't cooperate with us because they don't particularly want to encourage school shootings, I imagine. No thank you. Right, legitimacy of restriction. Well, they seem to suggest that you have an absolute right to publish whatever you want, on whatever basis you want, even if it harms the society around you. We already restrict what you can publish. We already restrict, for example, the types of things you can report on other crimes, like not being able to publish all the details of victims in certain crimes, like not being able to access certain court cases. All of those things are done in the justification of a public interest. No thank you. When that public isn't helped by having that information available to them, or when it will never truly be presented to them in a means that is true and accessible, or in any way worthwhile. So we're happy to think that it falls under this. Why is that? Because we have to balance it against the public good, against the people who might be harmed and the policies that will be worse when you have these facts at your disposal, instead of letting people make more rational decisions. First, because you have to sacrifice the victims again, and you have to sacrifice their families again. No thanks. Why does this happen? Well, that's because often we don't know the names of every student that was killed, but we do remember the killer. They're the people that get all of our time, all of our energy, and they're the ones that we prioritize. You might also get a cute story about the cheerleader whose future was stolen, but we would much prefer if those victims were the ones that had to be remembered, and those victims were at the center of the story, rather than the person that often did it in order to get attention.
Do you really, is the concrete harm that you're giving us in this debate that some people might copy the method, but these are people that definitely wouldn't otherwise commit school killings? Is that really it?
No, I think a clue that it wasn't just that was when I said that there's a policy good like hurting victims and their families literally just before you offered me that POI. But I will continue. The next thing is it also hurts the families of people whose children commit those atrocities too. Because often the blame is targeted at them, that they should have been the ones to do something about it, or know something about it, or spotted the warning signs. Often when there aren't any, because reading a book, or like whatever other methods we currently attribute as their motives, aren't sensible, aren't something that parents can know about or could have done something about. And so we have to understand that their child shouldn't be put up as the motive and the root of all evil, because that's what happens when you focus on the individual who perpetrated these actions, and we would prefer not to. No thanks. Then it also hurts your ability to make policy, right? Because the things that we've been told are the causes, as Mark tells you, range from having seen a movie to having read a book to having played video games. If that's what we think our policies should be tailored around, our policies can never be cohesive because they don't make any sense. And all you would be fighting for are having guns in everyone's hands in case someone turns into a shooter, and not letting people read or engage with anything that could turn them into a shooter. We'd much prefer to not have this information be presented. What can happen though is we're not just going to give up. We're not going to say that we can't ever attribute any cause to anything or make sense of anything. We're preferring to move that discourse to people who know about it and not people who speculate about it. So we say that mostly we haven't found any pattern yet. We haven't found why these individuals snap. We haven't found, as first opposition suggested, that it was all because of a mental illness that continues to systematically portray itself that we can make some sort of cohesive policy around. Most of the time, we can't get to any truth. But we certainly can't get to any truth when there are people who are sensationalizing stories as much as possible about these victims in order to make people afraid. What you have a better chance at establishing truth from, however, is when you have to actually allow people who are better at analysing those situations in private, like people who have degrees in it and are specialists in it. Those people can try and look for patterns. But if they do find a pattern, and if they do find a policy that would be cohesive and be able to prevent these killings from happening, they wouldn't even be able to get it across to us succinctly now, because we wouldn't believe them, because we've been tarnished by believing in all of the other causes that we've been told. We've been told about all of the random thousand factors it could be, so we're less likely to listen to the rational people who would tell us what it might be and make those policies in private, when it's not simply about convincing us in the public. Last finding the causes, and the last thing we get, is first that there isn't one necessarily, and we shouldn't pretend to people that there is a cause that we can find out in 10 lines of article, and that's selling the public a lie that we shouldn't, and it doesn't make them safer. Next, we say that it is much more beneficial to not focus that story on the one time that it happened, on the one guy and why that one guy did it. We should try and find out why many people do it, why a phenomenon is arising, and not simply focus on blaming that one person as we do. So we don't think that is sufficient. It was never our contention that literally every person who reads literally any article will go and shoot people at school. But what it was is that there are individuals who have used this to become better killers, to develop better strategies, to see that there is a way when you feel abandoned and lonely and full of hatred that you can be remembered as something. That steals from all of the victims, it steals from society, and it makes those people more likely to be remembered in a way that they shouldn't be, while distracting us from real policies that we're proud to propose.
I'd like to call on Ruairi to close today's service.
When Anders Breivik began shooting in Norway, the immediate reaction of just about everyone in the Western world was this was yet another Islamic terrorist attack perpetrated by someone who's brown, who's probably a little bit crazy, and definitely not one of our own. The reality is that we live in a biased, sexist, racist society and often bring our own prejudices. The point Ben brought about the reaction in terms of race is not that we're standing for racism, it's that the public often jumps on perceptions of race when you don't tell them otherwise. They often view those characteristics. That was problematic. 3 things in the speech. First of all, we talk about gun control, why it's probably useful, particularly that's causing government wants to talk about that, it seems. Second of all, we talk about media and alternatives. Finally, we talk about copycat killing. For that, briefly, 3 points of bottom. First of all, it's really nice when Christine stands up and tells us, yeah, we limit other forms of speech, Yeah, we kind of do. We're just saying this is a bad one. Second of all, in terms of families, very briefly. First of all, I think it's slightly presumptuous, even though she's a really good debater apparently, is that to entirely say in all circumstances what families actually have to want. You think that should be left on a discretionary basis. Often in many circumstances, families who've gone through a trauma want to tell that story to the world. Given, like, for example, the ubiquity which political prisoners of war often want to tell those stories to the world, I think families should be allowed to do that in the circumstance. So first, very briefly, gun control, right? So even if there are a variety of motives, right, the means by which they do it is exactly the same in every scenario. And also, given the pattern is in the US rather than say in the UK, where we also had a school shooting that no one seems to have copied it, it seems to be the common factor is in fact the access to guns, right? That might be a thing. So, first of all, in terms of effective gun control, because note in the United Kingdom, in the aftermath of the Dublin shooting, we massively restricted the ability you can get the ammunition and handguns, which now means that gang fights in the UK often don't happen particularly viciously because they try to make their own ammunition and therefore it's less successful. The United States, we can buy almost unlimited ammunition. The first thing Ben tells you on this, which Christine conveniently ignored, was that you need the right in the United States, which funds the NRA, which has the entire Republican Congress in its back pocket, essentially, to buy into gun control. Given, let's see, for example, the NRA that has already had a massive membership increase, you need to buy them into that. A couple problems here. Number one, the fact is that the famous taunt of the right in the United States is that the media has a liberal bias. At the point at which they are hiding elements behind these school shootings, the automatic perception is this is a liberal, democratic bias against us. They're trying to manipulate that story and trying to coerce you into giving up your guns. That's particularly bad, which means people don't even get the political buy-in in that circumstance. But secondly, it takes the absolute moral condemnation of that school shooting and our focus around that, and then it becomes, what's the government up to? You divert the media attention away from that proper consideration. But finally, method is important in our response to gun control. The fact people used assault weapons, and whether or not those are legitimate considerations of the Second Amendment in the United States, are actually things that have to be up for discussion. These guys wanted to ban the description of the weapon, but when the right say we don't have to ban what are weapons of war, because my Second Amendment right defends that, the most important argument against that is that no, they're being used to shoot kids. That's the most important thing, the most visceral argument the Liberals can use against that. The reality is that details, in terms of the description, in terms of the identity and demographics, are also important in this debate, in terms of gun control. Because often the reality is that you often tend to identify with victims more if they're from your own community or your own demographic, because often you're closer to the empathy gap better. But often the detail, Christine tells us that we don't remember the details of the victims. That's a lie. We remember them in circumstances when they are incredibly young, and we all know the ages of the Newtown shooting. These guys want to blank that out in perpetuity. Given the horrendous pattern of constant shootings in schools, we only remember them in the extreme circumstances. We want to take those extreme circumstances and galvanise political capital for that. We've been having school shootings for 30 years. Only when it comes up a large number of really young kids, so you galvanise political capital. You actually reduce the ability to do that. But second of all, you have to get a critical mass around the story. Given the hundreds of school shootings, you often go away in 24 hours, in very short news cycles. You need a good story and a background and a narrative around that, which is putting restrictions on prevents it in order to get the critical mass to buy into that. That's problematic. So, statistically, simply speaking, that not reducing gun control means you have more guns, which means more people have them, which means statistically more people are going to shoot them. If I've got to magically solve the motive, right? These guys prevent the best political method for changing gun control. Christine.
Okay, so at the very beginning of the speech, Mark named you 4 different killers. Can you please name me 4 individual victims? And if not, that's because they're not remembered as anything but a collective when the killers get remembered individually.
It's not necessarily that we remember their names. It's necessarily that we remember the fact that they're incredibly young and they're incredibly innocent. The fact of not remembering who they are is that they resemble someone who's innocent. That's the reaction you get. Even if you remember only one name, you remember who they targeted were young and vulnerable. That's the political reaction you get. That's why, Newtown, given Obama, the far greater political capital than any other shooting in his entire in recent memory. So second of all, let's talk about the media. So thank you. So what I want to note here is a couple of things. First of all, media tends to want to guard their reputation because they tend to be called out about it by competitors. And they're not seen as newsworthy or trustworthy. They tend to lose advertising revenue as a result. So there's often an incentive for you to downplay things you don't know, particularly in the aftermath of recent events in the past. So to the extent to which we fantasize about things we don't know. I think that's limited to an extent. The second I want to say is that social media, you can't regulate it, right? These guys say we can regulate it to a degree. The point is, it'll always spill out. So the problem is that the net is comparative. So still rumours are circulating. It's far better to put it in a context in which people are accountable corporations are accountable as opposed to social media which has absolutely insufficient libel laws. Finally, very briefly, let's talk about copycat. So the reality is that statistically, having more people with guns is bad. But these guys want to paint it as these are copycat through methods. So the problem is that's culturally contingent because Dunblane never had that. This is not a universal system, universal consequence of all school shootings. It depends on that context and whether or not it's reacted to like that. So there's a lie to buy this as a universal truth in this debate. We often say it obviously can't be a political activity because it receives no public support. So it's often like more personal motives. Consider, for example, the Newtown shooter shot his mum and pursued to shoot at school in revenge because she worked there because she saw it as an extent of her. So often these are often deeply personal motives that I don't think often like to be copycatted. But moreover, Mark tells us they're not all the same. All motivations are the same. I mean, this is true, but that limits the extent to which they're able to claim they're able to limit all other individuals' violence. But finally, very briefly, say that they'll copy methods to make it more effective. I mean, bar army teachers, the asymmetry of violence between a shooter with a gun and 6-year-old kids is so large that it makes a marginal difference at best. In reality, this simply means people are more likely to label as black African Americans or Islamic or Islamists shooting kids. It would reduce political capital to effect proper gun control, which is the most important thing, the most true way to prevent school shootings in the future. We're proud to oppose.
Thanks, Ruairi. I'd like to call on open the case for closing government from Leeds, Mr. James West.
I mean, the English they were scared.
Says that we don't know why people commit these kinds of atrocities is because some truths are simply too terrible to face. And the truth that we won't face is that we are responsible for the crimes that we commit. If anyone in this room read a newspaper article about the Aurora shooting, if you tweeted how horrified you were with the acts that were committed there, if you said how you were fascinated with the depth of human depravity, then you have contributed to a system which makes these kind of killings more likely to occur. We say that the policy is given to us by opening government, if enacted, will reduce the number of people who are killed, and that is our overriding goal. We're going to examine the psychological incentives people have to commit these kind of atrocities. We're going to look at exactly what motives people have. Before that, 5 points of rebuttal. Ben says, we want to have a discourse around mental illness. Many of these people are not mentally ill, they're just sad, lonely arseholes. But secondly, we're happy to do other things. We're happy to do other things to improve mental illness. Okay, there is no mutually exclusive nature there. Then he said, we're going to have worse short-term responses. We note that, no thank you, when we are given information from a source we know to be often unreliable like Twitter, our usual course of action is to go and corroborate that information from other sources which we know to be reliable, like CNN. At the point at which CNN is not available and the only source of information is the police, we're far more likely to do what they tell us because we haven't just seen an article that says the police don't actually know what's going on, okay? At that point, given the police probably in most cases do know what's going on, we're far more likely to follow ways actually in our best interests, though our own short-term terror means that we don't know what that is. Then they said there was no backlash of Dunblane. Yes, there was. There was the Cumbria shootings in 2009. The fact that it is charged to get rid of guns in Britain because of existing gun control laws does not mean that people do not and have never committed copycat attacks, okay? We're also going to... Then they said, the discourse around gun control is problematic. we agree, for the very simple reason that on average in the US, one person dies every hour from a gun shooting, and they are not in schools. They are out in the streets, in gang wars. And the unfortunate problem, and we can only galvanise discourse around gun control when school shootings happen, is that we ignore the vast majority of people who are killed by them and what should be our reasons. Moreover, no thanks, it's really easy to pick hold in their examples, as the NRA have been doing by pointing out that Adam Lanza would still have been able to get the guns he used to commit the shooting because they were bought legally. At that point, when your case for gun control is resting entirely on specific incidences, all you have to do is show that proposed laws are not effective in that case, and you dismantle the actual reasons for doing it. We want to focus on the real case for gun control, which is generally throughout the country. Then they said there's a liberal bias in the media, and people think they're scared. One, don't care, but two, I don't see how there can be like a liberal bias in death certificates, which are verified by doctors, which we could presumably provide to people in accordance with the documents by first hand. No thanks. So, why do people kill in schools? The answer is that our media response to these events creates a specific set of psychological incentives that make these crimes more likely to occur. Who commits school shootings? There are various factors at play, things like political ideology, things like racist beliefs. But at the core, most killers tend to have the same basic social characteristics. They're not in secure and loving relationships. They're not in positions where they are recognised and respected. They tend to be socially isolated, and they feel undervalued. These structures create a situation where a shooting can occur. Because when individuals suffer problems across all relationships, it's far harder to cognise yourself as a sad and lonely idiot than it is to recognise everybody else as being someone who simply doesn't understand you or doesn't recognise the values that you actually have and who need to be told what you're really like. Why is that problematic? The only way to overcome those barriers when everyone is so ignorant of your true values and your true power, no thanks, is to commit a spectacular act that makes you seem valuable, that people cannot ignore to show you can't simply be another person who's just walking on by. Moreover, no thanks, given that is something that is a problem across all people, you don't need a specific target within relationships to you, you just need people who, a situation where you're going to be recognised as someone who did something. I'll carry on with this, but first we'll go from there.
Okay, James, that's a very detailed knowledge you've got about the background and circumstances of people who shoot others that's now aiding you when we're having a discourse about gun control. Michael thought that from me.
Yes, and that is the problem, as I will now explain. Why? So you create an overwhelming need to strike that. Why does the media and shootings make them more likely? Because the way we portray killers is one of fascination. We are all fascinated by the macabre details of what happened. We discuss a killer as someone who is so horrific, so utterly different from everyone else. They've exercised their power in the most potent way over other people. They are important. They are being discussed by other people in a way they weren't before. They are being mentioned. They are not going to ever be forgotten because we associate them with the worst act of human injustice, okay? Why? And moreover, people become fascinated with you and take you as a role model to model their own actions later, okay? Why is that particularly bad? Because in many situations, these people don't feel their lives are particularly worthwhile. And an ability to escape those kind of psychological constraints is easily worth the trade-off of losing a life which you don't happen to value particularly much anyway. Moreover, dying is particularly a good way to go out, right? Because you are never going to be able to be diminished in the eyes of everyone else. You can't become a sad old man locked in a prison cell because you are dead. You will always be the 25-year-old who is remembered as one of the most horrific people in the country, who will always be mentioned when these kind of things happen. At that point, you have an incredible reason to do this kind of thing and to be remembered and to commit the most horrific acts so that the law enforcement officials have no incentive to try and keep you alive. What happens when there's no coverage, when we don't say anything about the killer, when we only talk about what happened? There is no recognition of you. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody ever will know who you are. There is no difference between blowing your brains out at home and killing other people in a school. You are not remembered, and moreover, it makes it harder to go to school. Because the only remembrance people have of you is the bad things you did to others, the way that you were unable to be with other people in the worst way possible. We create the psychological incentives that these individuals suffer from and turn them into disincentives to do that, because your only way you are remembered is as someone who is completely awful to other people. Nothing else about you is ever known, only what happened because of it. That means that these people are less likely to do this in future.
because it's harder to go out and kill people. It's harder to get hold of guns, and there's no reason what to do. And moreover, you are not thought of as someone who is any way meaningful. You are erased from history. You never existed in the first place. It's that construct people are trying to escape. We stop people doing these shootings at all. We are very happy.
Please keep the noise to a minimum because it is quite hard to hear after that. So for UCL and HB, I'd like to call on Michael Ruairi.
Mr. Speaker, we don't know why these people do this in every instance. We don't know the exact reasons in each particular case. What we have built up is a wealth of understanding of roughly the types of situations where these people come from in the vast majority of situations. Something the proposition continue to ignore all down their bench. They continue to ignore the vast societal and social culpability in which we all share when somebody is driven to a point where Marx says they are not human, where Marx says that they are not worthy of our empathy, our sympathy, where they are not worthy of us ever remembering their name or the way in which that society abandoned them. We say that fundamentally what they create on proposition is a society which brushes under the carpet its own failings and seeks to fetishize some sort of idea that it is being attacked by some external force. However, that external force is its own citizenry. It's a citizen which it has failed to understand, which it has abandoned, and which is now criminalizing in the minds of individuals. Will these people still get attention? Yes, they will still get attention. Will they still commit attacks? Yes, they will commit attacks. Even if they don't get the mass media attention, their only reference point, therefore, is the people around them. They often will go out with the "I'll show you" attitude. I will still kill people at this school. I will still cause massive terror in the area around me, even if this doesn't hit international news media. We think that's still a massive motivation to those individuals. We say furthermore that people still commit suicide despite the fact that you don't necessarily publicize how people do it or what people's motivations are. We think people are still willing to do that and still make those decisions. We don't see why this would be any different. Right, in terms of empowering the electorate, we think that Mark tells you that this effectively gives people a textbook for how to commit these crimes. And yet he says, we don't know why it is that they do it. We say that what we have to do in this debate is fundamentally undertake a balancing exercise between a massive restriction of media freedom, which we are going to show you the benefits of, versus versus our side, where we actually tackle the root causes and attempt to find out what those are, and we believe that we're slowly beginning to gain an understanding of what those causes are. Firstly, though, just as an aside, that Christine brings this other concrete harm, that the victims' families deserve it. That's a reason not to report any crime ever. That's a reason not to report about any person who commits a crime, because that victim's family feels disenfranchised and feels like the system doesn't work for them at the point where we create biographies of people who commit crimes and of other serial killers. We don't believe that stands in this debate, because I haven't shown why these are particularly different, other than they don't like them and they don't want to face up to them. In relation to this charge that they say that these people are no longer human, we'd say what caused them to be that way might be a very good way to stop people going into schools and killing people. We think that actually acknowledging that this is a horrific statement for any society to have to make if they believe that it is actually true and that these people are beyond saving. It's actually acknowledging that this is the ultimate abandonment of a citizen, a vulnerable person within your society. We say that very often they are relatively normal people. Very often you did sit beside them in that science class. Very often they were someone who that teacher didn't give help to after school. Very often there was no one they could go to with their problems. They didn't trust their doctor. They didn't have someone who was trained and able to give them the help that they needed. Christine laughs this off. We say that it's offensive to do that. We say that assumes that people actually have the ability to access services and access trained people. We don't know where those people are. We say that if we had those, people would actually be able to access those services and better themselves and not end up in situations where they feel that this is what what they have to do. We say that this restriction of freedom means we don't ever fess up to ourselves or to those individuals about our own failing. They're the one that's the outsider. They're the one that's the weirdo for having a mental illness. We say that we learn about these people, and we challenge ourselves to see how this situation is created when we can personalize that story, when we can look at the fact that Adam Lanza's mother has nowhere to put her child, that she feels that he's going to be safe and that people are going to be safe from him. When you create a discourse where people are able to explain to the nation at large that 55% of the people behind bars in the US suffer from a mental illness, and that a large reason for that is because the only way to put someone who you believe is a potential Adam Lanza dealt with and looked after is not to put them into a rehab clinic, because that rehab clinic doesn't exist. You have to get that person convicted of a felony and locked up in jail. We say that that's a massive crime by that society against that individual, and you justify that by saying that it's their fault, by somehow saying that they're not deserving of being remembered, and it's somehow their fault that they created this situation. No thank you. We think that these families are helpless. We think that families like them around America with potential other Adam Lanzas are the ones who we need to look to. We say that those are the people who are damaged by a policy which silences them, which makes them the ones that are victimizing everybody else, which makes them the bad person. We say that when I'm a mother or a father with a child, and I don't know what to do with that child, when there's nowhere that I can face, nowhere that I can go to actually get that child, something done for that child, when no political institution wants to listen to me because my child is the freak that we're not allowed to report about when he inevitably does shoot someone, we say what that does to you is it massively disempowers you. It means you lose all political capital to actually ever create a real change within that society because nobody's willing to listen to you because you're the freak. Christine.
Okay, but that could be true if in the vast majority of cases we portray these murderers as lovely people who got it wrong. Mostly we just make them seem like they're evil.
No, we say that no, we don't. Right, firstly, I'll deal with that in a second. No, we don't. They're almost all of the time people who suffer from severe mental illness, who have been repeatedly abandoned by teachers, by social workers, by doctors, by people who never listen. It's not just a blind assertion. Even if they were people with an ideology, we say people with ideologies, we as a right, we as a state are responsible for the actions of our state and for the feelings of our state because we're complicit in it when we vote for it and when we say that its policies are what we want. We say furthermore, if it's implementing a policy that means extremists of a certain ideology commit these crimes, then we have a right to know that the policy our state is undertaking is having that effect. We have a right to know that there are groups within our society which are disenfranchised. We have a right to know all of this because firstly it gives us an ability to fix it, but secondly because we're morally implicated when those things happen, right? Now, in terms of why imagery in particular is necessary and why not just give people the raw data, we think this is really important because the whole reason why news corporations choose to market any story in the way that they do is because people can't just listen to raw data and raw facts from professionals that these guys seem to want to do. Because we say that that's firstly not interesting, so they won't take any interest, but secondly because they can't process that information, because we have to personalize these sorts of stories in order to place myself in a situation where I'm afraid that my child might do something, where I'm spurred to outrage, I'm spurred to action simply because I can see this is a situation that might very well happen to me or to a cousin or to another friend or family member. We say that when we as a society actually step back and look at these things and say we're not going to talk about it, we're going to sweep it under the rug because you are a horrible, evil person. You homogenize killers, you say that they're all killing for the same reason. We don't want to know what that reason is because we're too afraid. We say we owe ourselves a duty, we owe those killers a duty, their families a duty, potential killers, and also any future victims by actually creating a preventative policy by proudly opposing it.
around them is what the problem is. That they are doomed, and that is not their fault, and that someone has to be punished for this. We think these people often see the way the media treat them and have an almost rational incentive to kill not just themselves, not just the people who made them miserable, but everyone, as many people as possible, because that's how they can reverse the situation, and that's how they can punish everybody. I've got 5 pieces of responses to what Michael said. Firstly, right, Michael says we all need this information, right, because what we can do with that information is change our lives. Firstly, but the only people who really need this information are policymakers, right? But moreover, we think like what's more important actually is that when we do get this information, stigma to these kinds of people is more likely to happen, right? Because of the way in which the media treats them. The media necessarily sensationalises the way in which these stories manifest. The reaction we see from when we see things happening is not a call for better ways for treating these people. What we hear is we should be locking these people up, right? We hear there should be tougher sanctions. We think actually what happens is there's more of this stigma that you guys don't want. And then he says, these people will probably kill anyway. James and I agree. They probably will. But they'll probably kill the girl that left them, they'll probably kill the kids that bullied them, and they won't kill everyone else. It's a numbers game. We think by the media, with the media circus coming to town, that incentivises you to kill the most amount of people possible, right? And then they said, okay, well, clearly, it's not enough. The victims will get upset and their families get upset, right? We have to show a distinction. The distinction is there's a difference between reporting on an ordinary crime that happens and interviewing the families, and what happens when school shooting happens, which is the media circus comes to town and it subsumes an entire town and an entire collective into one tragedy. They go around, they interview everybody, and they make everybody part of that story. They make everybody internalise it. That's the kind of trauma that's accentuated and extended. And bear in mind, the media also have rational incentives to extend that story, to make it last as long as possible, to tell as much news about it, to captivate us as much as possible. And then he says, we have the right to know. We can see there may be a right to know, but not at the cost of more lives. Not at making it more likely that somebody will kill. That's an unfortunate truth. We have to concede that there may be a right that ours is more important. So what 2 questions am I going to ask from someone today? Firstly, what's the best way to tell this story in the aftermath? Secondly, how do we stop this happening again? So firstly, because we think when school shootings happen, there are more victims than just the children themselves. There is a community, there are families, there are future members of that community, and there are those who are affected by it. What Mark tells us is often we don't learn anything from what the media does. These guys' problem is that the media tends to speculate. The media tend to speculate anyway. I see very little evidence in recent school shooting coverage of media being unwilling to speculate. Insofar as they do, that speculation is going to be less credible the point at which it comes from Twitter and you have no verifiable news source, right? When that happens, what you get is what James said, where people don't go to CNN, people don't go to Twitter, they go to their local police force, they go to the school themselves, they form community collectives and discuss it. That's how you get the kind of information that can better protect you. That's also how you get the kind of information which is relatable to you and get the actual kind of cathartic response that means these communities can move on in a meaningful way, right? We don't think necessarily what you guys said stands, right? Moreover, we think that it is important to reduce trauma in these aspects, right? Yes, this is also an issue that affects the whole country, but it affects mostly victims. We have a burden to those communities. Yeah.
How does your proposition help, or do you accept that it in fact hurts potential future victims?
No, because James explained it to you, right? The point at which there is no, your name isn't going to get plastered everywhere, you can't get notoriety. There is at the very least less incentive to do this. It's at least less rational for you to be able to get fame and notoriety by doing this. And moreover, they probably just kill the people who upset them rather than an entire school in order to get media attention, right? So what happens? This is the second question. How do we best reduce these things happening again? And there's 2 facets. The first is that we can reduce immediate copycat shootings happening. I remind you that in the aftermath of every single school shooting that's happened in recent memory, there has been a copycat, either attempt or a successful shooting within the next 3 months, right? This happens because individuals do see this and do see themselves as analogous. No matter how much we want to say, no matter how much communities want to say, we couldn't possibly see this coming. There was no way in which this would happen again. This is unique. This is something which shouldn't have happened. These are things that can happen. Why? Because people like school shooters exist all around the country, as James tells you. These individuals do tend to share qualities which are found everywhere, right? Individuals who aren't in loving relationships, individuals who don't value themselves, individuals who hate everyone around them, and individuals who are, moreover, most of the time, suicidal, right? But these individuals can't conceptualise themselves as the one with the problem, because we're human. That's a defence mechanism we take. They conceptualise the world around them as a problem. But moreover, they internalise their isolation as something which is unjust. They internalise their isolation and the fact that nobody pays attention to them and nobody knows who they are as necessarily a problem with everybody else. We think by covering school shootings, we paint a logical path to reconcile their problems in a way which seems rational for them to do. Because not only can they take revenge on everyone around them, they can get the one thing they've been craving more than anything else: attention, notoriety, to do something great. Because the definition of great doesn't just mean something which is good; it means something which is remembered. Moreover, what we say on this is that human beings have that rational path painted for them, and they can't just, what happens on our side of the house, these people probably do kill themselves, but they kill less people. They can't get that fame. I would also remind you, the media doesn't just print their names, they humanise them. They don't just say who they are, they investigate and interrogate aspects of their lives. It's not just that these people, their names are known, their stories and who they are known, and the potential for people to see their point of view is known. And that's where that incentive comes from. Lastly, creating policy change, right? Because we think what happens under the status quo is every single time we try and push policy through, what happens necessarily is Democrats get blamed for using this one case, right? And so long as school shootings are held up as the one case, Republicans can always say this wouldn't help in that instance, right? When we make the only continuous aspect of every single case a gunman, an unknown, unnamed gunman, the gunman, and the idea that he has a gun is the one continuous thing that is the problem. Moreover, we draw attention away from those and divert attention towards the real problem, which is in the streets, which is where the most amount of people die. What we get is more political capital for change. What we do is we stop sick, twisted individuals having a rational incentive to do this again and solve their problem. And moreover, we deal this with the victims better. I am very proud to propose.
Thanks for Stephan. The final speaker you see on HP and the final speaker of THW 2013, Hannah Lucy.
Ladies and gentlemen, in summing this debate, I want to talk about two things. First of all, I want to talk about protection, how if they say that's the most important thing, they don't provide that. Second of all, I want to talk about victims, why their definition is narrow, why it's sometimes offensive, and when we think this is a tragedy and we should recognise it and stuff and try and help people. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about why if protection is the most important thing, you do not deliver it on the proposition side of the house. First of all, they say it's pointless, why are we wasting our time thinking about why people do it? We're never going to find an answer. Actually, the reason we spend time thinking about this is because it's very much connected with preventative measures. We recognise that sometimes we don't get the answers. Sometimes, though, it is helpful to know, look, if somebody suddenly starts to isolate themselves after seeming like a normal bloke, and yet now gets an interest in Nazi memorabilia that wasn't there before, if they start portraying behaviour that was abnormal to their behaviour before, that is a good tip-off point. Maybe some people can get involved. Maybe that's a nice preventative measure that we think with necessarily knowledge about the killers actually enables us, in some cases, if not all, to try to prevent these attacks. Second of all, they say that fundamentally we don't get policy change. We think this is not true. Because of all the stuff that first upbring you in terms of actually having information about the type of guns that were used possibly is helpful in terms of trying to know the details of your legislation. But second of all, because of what Michael told you about what policy change actually needs. It needs public support, ladies and gentlemen. It needs people on your side. Why is it that Democrats have been trying for ages to get gun control laws? Didn't work. Suddenly we have a spate of killings that are tragic, and people know the story. They know the tragedy of it. Furthermore, they know the detail that Adam Lanza's mother, or Adam Lanza, the most recent time, the gun was actually given to him in childhood by his
creates the public support that allows people to enact change. We do get policy change on our side of the house because we get people enacting forward when they see the trial. Third of all, they say, no, listen guys, this is all about the notoriety. People get the idea, they're feeling a bit sick, they're feeling a bit lonely, and now we give them way to be infamous. No, why is this? Because they misunderstand what that loneliness, what that notoriety might mean to people. This is what Michael said. So, when they have already acknowledged that there are other sources out there, books, rap songs that advocate this, or certainly suggest it as a possibility, you have to say, like, removing this doesn't remove the source of imagination. Like, there are other ways that you can come up with this idea. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, just enacting that desperation, that violence on members that you know, even if it's just your family, even if it's just like the people from that school, even if it's just your college, sure, it's not going to be mass spread, but it's still notoriety for you. Therefore, we don't think you're preventing those people acting in that way. They say that you're not going to have the cumulative effect of it. We say you can still very possibly have that in individual circumstances. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we dismiss their current causal link. They say, like, media portrays something and then it happens off. We say no. This is happening all the time, ladies and gentlemen, separately. We think that what happens is actually little attack, little attack, little attack, big attack. Then the next little attack gets reported. That's how the media works. We dismiss necessarily their causal link. We don't think they portray that.
No.
Let's talk about the second point of clash. Let's talk about victims. Once we establish that we don't think they're actually protecting anybody on their side of the house. Because necessarily, when proposition couched in terms of never being able to understand people, these people have committed an act that is so inherently unhuman that we can't even see them as people anymore. That creates a harm. Go for it.
Our approach to getting empathy for people's mental health issues is to say, quickly, let's get them somewhere that we can put them, because they might turn into murderers. That's not empathizing. That just makes it more alien.
So Christine is suggesting that the only solution that we can see is that we think that we should incarcerate people. Funnily enough, that's the status quo. That's what we do. We just have to commit the act beforehand. That's not actually what Michael is saying in terms of the fuzzying up of mental illness. What happens here, ladies and gentlemen? Second proposition, bringing the idea that there are psychopaths and there are those that are mentally ill. So there are those who are doing it because they're not necessarily responsible for their actions, and there are those who are just, in their words, arseholes. We recognize that distinction, right? Often other people in society don't. And where the harm falls is with the mentally ill. People then don't say, oh well, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. They know that when you're mentally ill, sometimes that can cause you to act in abnormal ways. And they also know that sometimes there are people who do this and they're culpable. So the whole interesting idea about that, ladies and gentlemen, is that people in America, for instance, don't accept insanity as a reason for getting out of justice. They don't think that should be part, like a mitigating claim. And that's incredibly harmful, because it also homogenizes the idea of what mental illness is. It homogenizes the idea that it is likely that these people are just crazy, subnormal. Oh yeah, sometimes they are mentally ill, but to be honest, they're all just crazy and beyond our understanding. What do we do on our side of the house? When you can give the information that this person was normal, was like acting in a behavior that was completely healthy and changed, that person is mentally ill, ladies and gentlemen. So we get a discussion rather than the person who always betrayed or who cultivated a belief in themselves they had to act in this way. Therefore, we allow people to see a distinction between those who are psychopaths and those that are mentally ill. Therefore, if that person happens to survive, we want to hear about the justice system for that person, how they were dealt with in the courts, and somebody says, honestly guys, we think that's insane. We get more people accepting the idea that they weren't responsible for their actions, as opposed to the idea when we have this befuddlement, oh, anybody who does this is just beyond our belief, beyond our understanding. But instead of that befuddlement, we actually get people accepting. They say that doesn't happen on this side of the house because it's not like the media are nice to these people. First of all, let's just accept that's a contradiction, because on their side of the house, they want to paint them as normal freaks who are arseholes. So at the very least, that's a wash. Second of all, we already hear from first prop, they dismissed Twitter, they dismissed the Sun, because that's not where people get their sources of information. So at the very least, if they're looking to the news, that falls on our side of the house. Third of all, we think that often the news does give key bits of information in this task, they change. People who were in science class and were fine suddenly started acting this way. I didn't expect that. All that kind of unbiased information is very important. When Adam Lanza's mother can create a blog account that gets 2 million followers, recognize the distinction because some people were left alone, when we recognize that the idea of victimhood, the idea is multifaceted, that we can't just dismiss tragedy. We think that we actually get a society that helps people, rather than those that dismisses them and says we shouldn't